All right, I'll start then. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I am Tina. I'm the director here at the Randall Library, and I'm really excited that Barbie's going to be here tonight. Of course, I know Barbie in a different capacity. She's one of the trustees, and she was part of the team that hired me almost 3 years ago, so thank you, Barbie.
Thank you, Barbie.
However, over the years, I've learned that Barbie is quite the accomplished person. She's an educator. She's a lover of music and opera. She's a wife and a mother, and a sailor, which I didn't know, a cancer survivor, a volunteer, a world traveler, and an author. So that's among other things, I'm sure. So that's all I'm going to say. Without further ado, here's Barbie Wolfenden.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for all coming. I'm very, very pleased and flattered that, well, not flattered for myself, but pleased that you're interested in such a historic and important event in our history. And this is really why I wrote the book. It is a history book, and I feel that the story has to be told. It all started, I was on a cruise to Alaska with my husband of a couple of years. I knew he was a survivor, not of a concentration camp, but he had been shipped off from Austria to England in 1938 when Hitler arrived to take over Austria. And he spent the next 7 years being lonely, frightened, didn't know what was happening a lot of the time, but was protected by a very special school. And during that cruise, we were with some of his friends who had been at the Stoatley Rough School. And I was regaled night after night with stories of teenage pranks, horrified by stories of what these children went through in their school days before they were shipped away to England. And I thought, somebody has to write this down. And now I had dabbled in short stories, but I thought, okay, why not? So I did write it, and this is what happened with it. Before 1938, just a quick review of the history. You will all remember that in the end of the World War I, with Germany as a loser, was severely punished. Economically had a very tough time of it. And that was coupled with the worldwide depression of 1929, and Germany was plunged into despair and economic hardship. Along comes a savior by the name of Adolf Hitler, who promised a restoration of Germany to its former greatness. And the first thing he did practically once he became chancellor, and in fact the people in Germany didn't think he was all that much of a threat. He was a funny little man, not terribly good looking, but it turned out he was a killer. And he took over the chancellorship and began with the racial laws, playing on an innate hatred, not hatred exactly. There was anti-Semitism in the world in 1933, in this country as well, as you know. So he played on that. They were afraid of the communists. And anyway, they enacted the racial laws, which affected Jews across the country. It also started an emigration from Germany to England, which was the only country, really, which would take people emigrating from Germany at the time. The founders of the school were these three groups, Quakers who were very active in Germany during the build-up to the Holocaust. Many sacrificed their lives. They would testify in trials and pay for it. But the Quakers back in England, along with the Jewish refugee groups and members of the peerage decided they needed a school to teach these young German-speaking children English and prepare them for a career outside of their home. One of them, her name, she was an Episcopalian actually, Marjorie Vernon, had a couple of country mansions. She said, oh, I'll give you one of mine for the school.
Nice.
And called Stoatley Rough, and it was on a hanger, they call it a hanger, it's a cliff overlooking the South Downs, right toward London, 40 miles south of London. And that became the school. They reconstructed it, and they recruited one of the displaced people in England that the Quakers had known, Bertha Bracey, hired Dr. Hilda Leon. Hilda Leon had a PhD from Cologne University in social studies, and she had been the director of the German Academy that is mentioned there, but was kicked out of her job being Jewish. She immediately agreed to come. She happened to be a lesbian as well, which really has nothing to do with the story of Stoatley Rough, but it makes for an interesting little side story. The first person she hired to come along with her was her lover, another PhD of German literature and a writer and poet, Dr. Emmy Wolf. She then recruited two other couple of ladies to be the matron and the woman in charge of handicrafts. So she had a skeleton crew to begin with. They then hired English-speaking English teachers and math teachers and science teachers and so on from that. In the beginning, this school was founded in 1933, so it was really at the very beginning of the persecutions. It had a normal English curriculum, academic curriculum. It was very low-key. Children were able to contact their parents back in Germany. Sometimes the parents would just be vacationing in England, and they would put their kids in the school. There was a strong music program. Oh, I forgot to mention. A fifth PhD lady came to the school halfway through this early part of the school, and she immediately became a rival for the affections of Dr. Hilda Leon, and there was quite a hoop-de-doo. But interestingly enough, the kids whom I interviewed and knew later on, the grown people, they said as children they really didn't understand. They knew something was strange. Dr. Leon and Emmy Wolf lived in a bungalow that had been built for them. But when the final lady came in, the music teacher, who stole Dr. Leon away from Emmy Wolf, there were fireworks, and the kids often heard arguments late at night when they were supposed to be in bed asleep. I mentioned the household girls in red because these were young women who had already completed their academic training, but were sent to Stoatley Rough for safety. So what to do with them? They ended up becoming, the faculty was so well versed in the domestic sciences, as they called it, which was very, very important in the 30s. Home economics, we call it today. But they made it into a real science, and these girls were taught how to create the best cleaning solution with the right amount of Clorox or whatever they had at those days with lemon juice or whatever, how to iron properly, how to fold a shirt that had been ironed, how to take care of children, how to cook. And they became certified household managers as a result of this during the course of the 7 years or 10 years of however long these women were there, these young girls, I should say. They built a swimming pool. One of the fathers of one of the children at the school knew how to do this. They dug a hole. There was a little spring running through the lower part of the property. So this was a fun thing for the kids, although they said the tadpoles often got in the way of real fun. They also had a farm program, which during then in 38, when England entered the war and rationing became the law of the land, they grew potatoes, and they would sometimes make the children go out and dig up these potatoes frozen in the ground, and the kids would complain about that. But one advantage was for the older boys and girls, they were able to bunk in a little house down by the farm. And there was a farm instructor who had been hired to keep an eye on them. And strangely enough, you may be wondering, even though there were alliances made and marriages came out of these children at the end of the war, there were never any recorded pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies, or any behavior, because the children were so naive. And today it's just hard to imagine, where we have fourth graders who practically know more than we do about sex. But in those days, the kids just were completely innocent of, there would be hand holding. And in fact, once a bunch of Martin's friends who lived in a hut, they called themselves the Hut Boys, they said, well, we should have a girlfriend. We should have girlfriends. Some of you have read that part. And they said together, they say, well, who should we pick? Well, how about Elsa? Oh no, Leo already likes her. So then they picked another girl, and they said, okay, she's our girlfriend. And that was the end of it. Very, very sweet. So anyway, that would be enough about the farm program. So then in 1938 is when things got very serious, and really a sad turn at the school, when they were, the administrators were deluged with requests because the persecutions, the places where they were sent, the camps were organized, and Jews were being rounded up, and parents were very, very serious about getting their children out to save them. So my husband was Austrian. Most of the children were from Germany. Some were from Czechoslovakia. A few Swiss were there for other reasons, not even because they were Jewish, but because their father happened to be an engineer in some work construction. But most were Jews. And by the way, they did have bat mitzvahs for the boys during that time when they reached the age of 12. Anyway, so Austria in 1938, in comes Hitler. And it was drastic. So who can tell us about Kristallnacht? Anybody want to just remind us? Nobody wants to say it?
All the Jewish shops, their homes, all the windows smashed, people killed. And these were just your neighbors doing this to you, basically.
Exactly. The synagogues were attacked, burned to the ground while the firefighters stood by and watched. So, of course, Stoatley Rough had rented 2 houses in the neighborhood to take some of the overflow children, and some of the children had to go to the local school for their academics, but they lived in the main house. And the final solution in 1941 was arranged and had begun. So, yep. I would like to read something that was written by a friend of Martin's who survived, named Wolf Edelstein, became Wolf Elston when he came to the United States. His experience as a little boy, he would have been in school for about 3 years before he was shipped off to England. He was just going to a public school. His father was a lawyer. His mother was a pediatrician. Very rare in those days for women, but very well-off family. And he had been going to the school. I've got to find it. Stop talking. Let's see if I can find it here. And this is what his experience was in school. One day, a few older boys stopped him on the street to ask, "Are you a Jew?" The scholarly Wolf, his name was Wolf, said, "No, the Jews lived 5,000 years ago," puzzled by such a silly question. A few days later, his teacher asked the children to bring in a family tree with religions next to the names. It was only then that he discovered that all his grandparents were Jewish. He endured the Nazi version of religion and paganist dogma the teachers slathered upon the children. The teachers opened each lesson with Heil Hitler, as if voicing a religious incantation, and a new discipline appeared in the curriculum called Rassenkunde, racial studies. In subjects such as German literature and history, Nazi doctrine prevailed. Anti-Semitism was sanctioned by the teachers, and Wolf became the target of every bully. He was harassed and beaten. One day, a few boys pushed him down and urinated on him. So, Martin himself in Austria was often taken out by his nanny to sit in the park. But by that time, there were signs after Hitler arrived, no Jews allowed to sit on the benches. But he was very frightened because he was Jewish, but his nanny was Aryan, and she would say, "It's okay, we can just sit here." He himself witnessed Jewish elders being forced on their knees to scrub the sidewalks of anti-German slogans. And he recalls that before Hitler arrived, his nanny took him to a rally in which the crowds were all shouting, "Red, white, red forever." In German, that was the German flag, or the Austrian flag. He said about 2 weeks later, his nanny took him to another rally, and this was when Hitler was arriving by motorcade, and they were all going, "Heil Hitler." And Martin said that from that day on, he would always love Austria, but he hated Austrians. And we went to Vienna many times during our marriage. He really loved the country, but he was always suspicious of the Austrians. And we all know Austria took a long time in its reparations program. Okay, another class question. What was that? Anybody? Anybody familiar with it?
That was a movement to get as many kids out and shipped to England where they would be safe.
Exactly.
And rehabilitated in schools and foster homes.
Exactly. It was several countries got together and they organized trains to take children out of Czechoslovakia, Germany, Austria, called the child transport, Kindertransport. And between 1938 and 1940, about a year and a half, they managed to get 10,000 Jewish children out of harm's way. Many of those children ended up at Stoatley Rough. Some of them were taken into families who just used them as servants. Others were kind to them. You never knew. Some children arrived at Stoatley Rough traumatized by the handling they had received by their Kindertransport original parents, shall we say. So there's Martin at 10. Or he's younger than that in that picture, but he's just a cute little kid with lederhosen, and Vienna was a nice place to be. I want to tell you about his arrival at Stoatley Rough. Let's see, 12. Gives you an idea of, let's see if I can find it. Well, let's see here. I can't find it. I've lost that slide, that page. I'm sorry. I will just tell you that what happened. Oh, here it is. Here it is. So he was sent in the company of an older girl on a train to Brussels. He waved goodbye to his mother, who actually couldn't bear to go to the station, so he waved bye to his father. And he had been reassured, we'll get together again. And he was excited. He wore a little placard around his neck and had some of his toys. He was 10. And he ends up in Ostend, Belgium, and then they put him on a ferry. And he ends up being met in London by a friend of the family, who then put him on another train, and he arrived late at night to Surrey, where the school was. And they would put him to bed. So the next morning, in the kitchen, he saw large bowls of brown sugar and stewed fruit on a table. Some big boys stood near the outside door in rubber boots, ogling the girls until the cook told them to leave. Just outside the half door that led down to a corridor, he saw children carrying spoons and napkins. Then a big girl started handing out pitchers of milk to the children. Everybody was working. Martin's job was to stand on a chair next to the stove and stir the porridge with a long-handled spoon. And apparently that's what they did with every newcomer. That was their first job. He peered into the gloppy stuff and thought of the hard roll, butter, and mug of cocoa that his cook always placed before him every morning back home. The big girl in charge of him said, "Du musst das Porridge rühren, so dass es nicht verbrennt." You must stir the porridge so it doesn't burn. Nein, nein, nicht so schnell. He stopped listening. The edges of the pot got blurry, and in spite of trying with all his might, he began to cry. The big girl lifted him off the stool and gave him a glass of milk. "There, it's your first day after all. You'll be all right. We all had to leave our parents, but you get used to it. Somebody go get Miss Asphalt." So that was his first experience at school. And he latched on to one of the big girls, and then unfortunately, 9 months after he had been there, she left to go to India to get married. And he said it was a loss he could hardly bear because he already had lost his parents, and then he lost the big girl, and they all had to go through this. So these boys and girls and women and men never called themselves survivors. But I say they were survivors because they lost their childhood in a way that could never be replaced, being wrenched away so young. There he is on the English Channel. He looks happy enough. I just wanted to point out the front of the Stoatley Rough School, the Manor, looked out over a heath, and the older boys and girls used to sneak out at night and smoke cigarettes. And they'd walk the heath, and once in a while they'd run into Hilda Leon, who was out there also smoking. Okay. So the school was 40 miles south of London, and because it was on a hill, they could see the red skies during the Blitz when London burned. They also watched airplane fights, the Wolfwaffe against the RAF, and they would pick up shells from the bullets that were exchanged during the time. And they followed the war quite closely. So this is an original picture taken in 1938, and you can see every morning. This just shows the first layer. They had several layers going down quite a long way down to the bottom of the property. Every morning the kids would be rousted around 6 o'clock in the morning. They'd get dressed and have to run down the pathway down to the very bottom where they did calisthenics. Then they would walk back up, brush their teeth, get their clothes ready, and go to breakfast. This was part of the very popular educational system at the time. Fresh air, hard work. Does anybody recognize the name Gordonstown? Does that ring a bell? Who went to Gordonstown? King Charles. It was the rough and ready school that was formed at the same time as Stoatley Rough, and it had the same principles of hard work, hard living, really, no mercy. So, but one thing, I think they kept, it was a sort of form of security for the children, because they knew the rules. There was never any corporal punishment, which is very unusual for England at the time. But that was one of the strictures that were imposed, that the children were not to be paddled. They had a good curriculum, but they were safe. They were discouraged, however, from feeling sorry for themselves. Some kids might get regular letters from their parents, and then they'd stop coming. And nobody would say anything to the children because they knew something had happened. They didn't quite know. I don't think many people really understood the Holocaust outside of Germany until the end of the war. Yeah. So the effect of the war was pretty drastic on the children. The kids were scared. They were mainly afraid of paratroopers coming in. They were, after all, Jews. They spoke German, and they thought they might get captured by incoming German soldiers. They didn't like the food. There was rationing going on, and so they had leftover pie, which they hated. That would literally, the cooks would take anything that hadn't been eaten the day before and just put it into a gloppy mess, and they would be served. They got a kick out of the teachers, the German teachers, and Hilda Leon, because their English was terrible. But they would go around to the children always saying, "Sprecht English, Kinder," and they got a kick out of that because their English was way better than the teachers. So it was. Let me see. I guess I have one more thing to read about that. Oh yeah. As I said, one of the people wrote, "I did not make any close girlfriends. In fact, I believe we were not," this is a girl who wrote this, "we were not encouraged to do so. We were moved around so that we always had different roommates and never became too close to anyone." And that may also have been deliberate, to try to keep them on a very straight, unsympathetic path. Just do your studies, do your work. Although the kids did have a lot of fun. They did have I don't include it in this lecture, but there were many, many instances of projects they had. Teachers handled questions in class about sexual matters with more evasion, conflation, and denial than are wielded by today's most skillful politicians. Wolf was once sitting in class when the following dialogue took place. Our teachers were not particularly informative about matters of sex. In English literature one day, we were discussing Pope's Rape of the Lock. Now, I had to look this up, but I found out Rape of the Lock, in those days, in the 18th century, rape meant just carrying away, snatching. And the lock meant a lock of hair. So this is what it was. It was a satirical poem about a hero stealing a lock of hair. Anyway, so a girl pupil says, "What does rape mean?" And the teacher said, "Rape is, well, you know, it's just one of those words that want to make you squirm." On another occasion, the word virgin had come up. Girl pupil, "What's a virgin?" Teacher, "A virgin is a young girl who hasn't, who doesn't, well, you're a virgin, and Elsie," here, she's a virgin. Elsie, waking up from a daydream, said emphatically, "I am not." So they grew up. There's Martin, probably at the age of 16 or 17. They had Boy Scouts. He became what was known as a King Scout, which is an Eagle Scout in America. There are a couple of his friends. They were, during the air raids, they would become, the boys had to become runners to neighboring households and carry messages back and forth. And they didn't like it at all. They were, again, frightened that a parachute trooper would catch them. So they had many air raids. They all hung out in the basement whenever these happened. It was a big house, so they were safe. Sometimes they would be sleeping there all night with blankets and so on. Every noontime they listened to the BBC. They heard Winston Churchill every day. They followed the war very carefully. They knew where the troops were in Africa and Italy moving up. And the boys laughed about General Eisenhower. They said he had a voice that sounded like Donald Duck. So anyway, the war does end, and 1945, so the kids can leave Stoatley Rough. So what are they supposed to do? Many of them didn't want to leave. This was sanctuary. Many had lost their parents. They had nowhere to go. They may have some relative in New York, somewhere in Germany, somebody in Switzerland maybe. So many didn't want to leave, and many did not leave for a while till they could find work in England. It took them 20 years, but they finally started having reunions. And I went to several reunions, both in England and in the United States. And in 2016, I think they were celebrating a birthday. The two middle gentlemen are still alive. And I know them. They're friends of mine. One lives in Texas and one lives in New Jersey. And were very happy to have this book come out. That's Wolf. He was a very good writer. Many of them were just supplied to very well-written episodes of their memories of their time at Stoatley Rough. My sources were a Stoatley Rough newsletter that was organized. Also, as I said, the London School of Economics, which contained all of the archival material, and then reunions, talking to people. So there's the gazebo, which you could see. I told you about from this was taken from the manor itself, and I wanted to read one final thing. Again, written by a young woman from Berlin who lost her parents to the camps. She wrote, "The bombed out cities, the ruin and rubble of Munich had not prepared me for the destruction of Berlin. The formerly vibrant city was barely surviving. Once crowded streets were empty, filled with silence. The avenues, robbed of their majestic trees, were overgrown with weeds." Has anybody been to Berlin? So you may know the Kurfürstendamm, the main drag, and I think it's probably been restored to its former beauty. But she says the parks had turned into wasteland. The few passers-by hurried with downcast looks as if they dreaded to leave the safety of their shelters. Children were rummaging for food everywhere or begging for cigarettes. The silhouette of the mighty tower of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church stood ghost-like above the ruins of its sanctuary, looking down the Kurfürstendamm that had also lost its soul. And then she wrote, "Here were people who willingly followed their Führer to conquer the world. These people who years before treated me as an outcast were now ingratiating themselves to me." She wore the uniform of an American soldier of some sort. "It was such a strange situation, I could hardly interpret my own feelings. I was supposed to hate them with all my strength. but I could not hate. Or was it in the face of such suffering that hatred was silent? I would neither sit in judgment, nor would it be in my power to forgive and forget. Thank you. Anybody have a question or a comment? Yes, Carol.
Who funded the school?
The peerage, they did charge admission when they could, and in the beginning, there were mostly wealthy people sending their kids, so they were able to pay a tuition. When 38 came along, it was hard going. It was very hard going. There were Jewish refugee groups and so on helping out and giving scholarships to children. But many were turned away because they couldn't afford the modest fee. It was, after all, a boarding school. Yes, Susan.
How many children ended up at the school?
Probably at its peak, only 100. So it was a small school. There were several other schools formed at the time. One or two had started, they were private schools in Germany that just moved to England. And I just talked about Gordonstown. But it was small. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about what Martin did after the school closed?
Oh,
and the
yeah.
war ended?
Yeah, I think a fascinating thing that all of these, I followed about 7 men and women, what happened to them afterwards, but there were many more stories. Almost all of them ended up with very productive careers. They did very well. Martin himself became a systems analyst with Manor Corporation. Wolf was a professor of geology at the University of New Mexico. The other man was a professor of sociology at the University of Texas. In fact, another one was a university professor. These were his friends, but they were just a band of brothers, really, that had formed such a close association. So now some did not fare well. There were some suicides. There was a whiz kid. Now you're all too young to know that, but there was a program, a radio program at one time, like a quiz program, and one very bright kid was a whiz kid, but he ended up committing suicide. Many kids went to Canada, but the ones that I know about did very well.
Did they go to college after they left? So they stayed in England. They came to the United States.
Some went to college in England. They were Martin was preparing to go to. I guess they take exams to get into college there. Well, they do here too. But he came to America first, and then he and some of his friends went to school in New York, college. Some entered the army. A really quick, interesting story. One of the boys left the school, got in, he had graduated just in time before they closed down the shipping lanes because of the submarine activity in the Atlantic. But he got to New York. He ended up being drafted. They found out he spoke German. He ended up in a special group. And he joined the 82nd Airborne and went back to Germany during the war. And the war's still going on, and he became an interpreter. So they would capture Germans, and he would be interpreting for them. And he had to be very careful where he was, because if he were captured outside of the army compound, he could have been mistaken by his colleagues as a German in disguise. So these were interesting stories. In another case, a young man joined, both Martin and another friend also ended up in the army. They got citizenship for doing this. One of the other ones went back to Germany as well. This was after the war, and he was riding a bus one day, and he heard some people complaining about the war and the poverty and all that. And he said he didn't say anything, but he just felt, how dare you complain after, they killed his parents and his brother. So these are little stories that were so
Was
fascinating.
any evidence that Churchill or any of the English government officials were aware of the school? Did they offer any support for the school?
Not that I know of. No. No, you know.
Barbie, I was interested in your saying that when the war was over, that the kids were kind of on their own and had to figure out what to do. Considering that Jewish refugee groups and Quaker refugee groups usually do a lot of social work, trying to find people placements and help them transition, I'm curious whether some of that was done.
I have not researched that or have any direct knowledge, but I'm sure you're absolutely right that the Jewish refugee groups were very, very helpful to the school during the time. And as I say, the Quakers, there was a board of trustees that helped Dr. Leon manage the school. And I'm sure they found funding along the way. Yeah.
What happened to Martin's family?
Martin's family made it out. But one interesting story is that back in Vienna, after Martin had left, of course, his father could find no work, being Jewish. He ended up entering into helping another man forge documents and papers to get out of Austria. And they were arrested and sent to Berlin and put in jail. The other man confessed and said to the German authorities, he really was not responsible for this, I was. And they put him on trial and shot him. But Martin's father remained in jail in Berlin. And so through a tremendous amount of red tape and work, numerous trips to the offices, his mother finally escaped with her 3-year-old daughter, Martin's little sister. They went to Spain and they got a ship to the U.S. And then she worked to get her husband out of jail and managed. It's these stories, you know.
Were they in touch with each other? Like, how did they end up reuniting?
They're through the mail. Yeah, the mail. The Red Cross was very prominent in getting messages. The children at the school were allowed to write to their parents, but I found in the archives a whole bunch of little pieces of paper in German written, "Dear Mommy, I had an ice cream cone today," or something. It wouldn't be that, but, you know, or "I had a strawberry. I love you." You know, little things like that. When the Red Cross would take those little messages and then transcribe them into formal documents that were then sent out to various places in Europe, where hopefully the parents could pick them up.
So did Martin live with his parents?
Oh, so he joined, yes, it turned out his parents got a divorce. It's not funny, but I mean, irony of ironies. And he lived with his mother, and he went to school in New York. He had a part-time job, you know, not selling. He worked in a ballpoint pen factory. You know, but he had friends from Stoatley Rough who also ended up in New York. So he had a social life and met with them. And yeah, so then he went to school and graduated, and then I think it was after school that he ended up in the Army, served his time, then got married. Of course, not to me, I was his second wife.
How did you meet him?
I met him, how much time do we have? It's a rather funny story. I was single at the time for about 10 years, and he was too. We hadn't met. We both lived in Concord. Well, one of my girlfriends said, we should have a dinner party for 10 hungry men. So they advertised there were 10 of us women, they advertised, we're all looking for men, of course, advertised in the Boston Globe, and we had a phone number they could call, and we screened them. So these men called in, and they were screened, and the date was set, and 10 hungry men arrived at the home of one of my friends. So that was a success. Martin was not a part of that, but we had so much fun that we said, let's have another party, just have a singles party. So I said, I'll have it at my place. So we did, and one of the women had Martin, who was a friend of Martin's, invited him to come with his girlfriend. Well, he had just broken up with his girlfriend. So he arrived alone with a bag from Zabar's. I remember that. I opened the door and there he is, hello. And, we didn't pay much attention to each other during the course of the evening, but I had an etching by a German artist on my wall, and I noticed him looking at it. It said Schneeblumen, which means snowflowers. So I walked up to him, I said, sprechen Sie Deutsch? Having no idea. He spoke perfect English. And I just have to laugh. He said, yeah, and then he spoke to me in perfect German back. I realized, he was a native speaker, and that's how we met.
Great story. I'm so glad I asked. I'm sure everybody in the room is glad I asked.
It's a cute story. Yeah. Mary?
Did he ever go back and see his house in Vienna?
Oh, yes. We went back many times to Vienna. He loved the city.
Did the house survive?
Yes, it was an apartment, actually,
Okay.
in the Jewish district, overlooking the Danube. I think one of his favorite times was after a few years, he took his 4 children back with him. They didn't come with wives or husbands, they just came alone, and I didn't go either. He took them all back to Vienna, and showed them where he had grown up, and introduced them to Vienna. And the kids, of course, had a great time, and he would go to bed at night. They'd go out and party. So, yes, we went many times. It's a beautiful city. Who's been there? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Yes?
Barbie, when I was still practicing as a clinical psychologist, I was privileged to have 3 people in treatment. 2 of them did call themselves survivors.
Yes.
And one of them was a man who was born and raised in Vienna. He lived 3 blocks away from Freud.
Okay.
His family was very, very wealthy, and they thought they would give him all the money they could in his clothing when he went off to England. And I don't know what school he went to, but when the war was over, it was Jewish support services that found a long-lost relative in New York. So he was sent across to New York. When he got there, this family had rejected Judaism. And here he had been with all these Jewish children the whole time he was growing up, but this family wanted nothing to do with it because they were afraid of the racism in this country. So he had to kind of suppress all of his Jewish love, let's put it that way.
Wow, that's a story.
Yeah, and he eventually went to law school and became an immigration lawyer. And he came to treatment with me when Trump said we have to take the children away. It brought back so many memories. It was a renewed trauma for him.
Yeah, people were very much damaged by the whole experience. I'm painting a picture of a lot of fun, but many were damaged. Didn't do well. Phil, did you have a question? No. Well, thank you so much for your attention.